The wind howling across the desolate plains of Oakhaven carried the bitter weight of unspoken sorrows. Inside an isolated cabin at the edge of town, Clara stood perfectly still. She was a slender silhouette framed by the dying embers of a cold hearth. A woman trapped in the shadow of a cruel man who was buried but far from gone. The town outside had already decided who she was, condemning her to a life of invisible shame and lonely whispers. But out on the horizon, riding through the fading amber light of a harsh dusk, a solitary figure made his way toward her broken fence, a man who did not care about rumors, a towering presence of quiet strength about to show her that some fires are meant to set you free. Welcome back to Cowboy Echoes. If this journey touches your heart, please subscribe and walk this trail with us. The morning sun bled through the cracked window panes of the homestead, casting long and jagged shadows across the worn wooden floorboards. Clara sat at the edge of a heavy oak table, her delicate fingers wrapped tightly around a tin mug that had long since grown cold. The cabin was silent, but for her, it was a silence entirely too loud, filled with the echoing demands and the harsh reprimands of a man who was no longer there. Silas was in the ground now, buried beneath the hard earth of Oakhaven Cemetery for over a month, yet his suffocating presence lingered in every corner of the room. His heavy woolen coat still hung on the iron peg by the door like a dark sentinel guarding her isolation. His scuffed riding boots sat rigidly in the corner, a constant reminder of the heavy footsteps that used to make her heart clench with dread. Clara was a woman of striking, delicate beauty, possessing a grace that seemed almost entirely out of place against the rugged, unforgiving backdrop of frontier. Her long, dark hair cascaded like spilled ink over shoulders that were too thin, framing a face with high cheekbones and eyes the color of a bruised twilight sky. Before she was bound to this life, those eyes had held the bright spark of youth and hope, but years of living under the thumb of a cold and bitter man had extinguished that light, leaving behind only the hollow gaze of a woman trying merely to survive. She wore a faded gray dress that hung loosely on her slender frame, trying to make herself small, trying to remain invisible to a world that had only ever offered her harsh judgments and unkind whispers. When she finally gathered the courage to step outside, the biting autumn wind whipped against her face, a harsh greeting from a town that wanted nothing to do with her. The walk into Oakhaven for her meager weekly provisions was a gauntlet she dreaded. The wooden boardwalks creaked under her tentative steps as she approached the general store, her gaze fixed firmly on the dusty toes of her boots. She could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes settling heavily upon her narrow shoulders. The good, respectable women of the town gathered their skirts and turned their heads, their hushed voices weaving cruel tales about the tragic widow who lived on the edge of the prairie. They whispered that she was cursed, that she had brought her own misery upon herself, punishing her for the mere crime of being tethered to a man they all knew was rotten, yet whom they had respected out of fear. Inside the dim and dusty general store, the silence was thicker than the prairie dust. The storekeeper, a stout man with a permanent scowl, placed her small sack of flour and dry beans on the counter with a heavy thud, not once meeting her eyes. He took her worn coins with a brisk, dismissive motion, treating her not as a customer, but as an unfortunate burden the town was forced to tolerate. Clara offered a quiet, trembling word of thanks, but it was swallowed by the heavy silence of the room. She gathered her supplies, clutching the burlap sack tightly against her chest as if it were a shield, and hurried back out into the harsh glare of the midday sun, her heart aching with profound and entirely crushing loneliness. The walk back to the solitary cabin felt longer than ever, each step dragging her further away from humanity and deeper into the suffocating tomb of her past. She crossed the threshold of the homestead, and the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind her, sealing her inside the mausoleum of her marriage. She set the provisions on the counter and leaned heavily against the rough wood, squeezing her eyes shut as a single, silent tear carved a path down her pale cheek. The air in the room felt impossibly thick, scented with the stale tobacco and worn leather that had defined her late husband. She opened her eyes and looked around, truly looked at the life she was trapped inside. The walls were adorned with his hunting trophies, the shelves lined with his meticulous, unforgiving ledgers, the floor dominated by the massive, immovable furniture he had built to assert his dominance over the space. It was not a home. It was a cage made of memories, and the door had been locked from inside. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her hand brushing against the ruffle of his coat, hanging by the door. A sudden, overwhelming feeling of panic rose in her throat, a desperate realization that she was slowly fading away, turning into a ghost haunting her own life, waiting for a savior that the world had promised would never come. She stepped back, her breathing growing shallow as the shadows of the room seemed to stretch and reach for her. She turned toward the front window, desperate for a glimpse of the open sky, a breath of the wild and untamed prairie. And that was when she saw it. Through the dusty, distorted glass, silhouetted against the vibrant, bleeding colors of the setting sun, a figure was approaching her broken gate. He was tall, his broad shoulders cutting a striking shape against the horizon, his horse moving with a slow, deliberate grace. The townsfolk never came down this road. The peddlers avoided her property. Who was this solitary rider stepping into the forgotten edges of her shattered world? And what did he want with a woman who had nothing left to give? The rider swung down from his saddle with a fluid, effortless grace that completely belied his massive frame. His heavy leather boots striking the hardened, sun-baked earth with a solid and reassuring thud. He stood at the edge of the property, a towering silhouette against the bleeding crimson and gold of the dying sun, one hand resting easily on the reins of a magnificent roan stallion. The beast shifted its weight, blowing softly through its nostrils, mirroring the calm and deliberate energy of its master. From the shadowy refuge of her doorway, Clara pressed her trembling fingers against the rough, splintered timber of the doorframe, her breath catching painfully in her throat. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a conditioned response to the arrival of any man, as she waited for the inevitable demands, the harsh tones, or the dismissive cruelty she had come to expect from the world. But as the man stepped forward and the shadows retreated from his face, Clara realized he was entirely unlike the men of Oakhaven. He was a man seemingly carved from the very rugged landscape he rode through, his broad, formidable shoulders stretching the fabric of a faded denim shirt. A heavy leather duster swept around his long legs, coated in the pale, sweeping dust of the open trail. He reached up with a large, calloused hand and slowly removed his weathered Stetson, pressing it respectfully against his chest to reveal a face lined by the harsh prairie sun and the relentless wind. He possessed a strong, square jaw shadowed by dark, untamed stubble, but it was his eyes that forced the air completely from Clara's lungs. They were a striking, piercing shade of warm hazel, catching the last ambient light of the setting sun, and they held a quiet, unwavering gentleness that she had not seen in another human being in more years than she could possibly count. He stopped a good distance from the porch, purposefully maintaining a respectful space between them so as not to crowd her fragile boundaries. "Evening, ma'am," he spoke, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that rolled across the quiet, desolate yard like the distant, soothing rumble of summer thunder. "My name is Elias Vance. My horse threw a shoe a few miles back on the ridge, and I was hoping I might trouble you to draw a bucket of water from your well before I make camp tonight." Clara hesitated, her survival instincts screaming at her to retreat into the dark cabin, to slide the heavy iron bolt into place, and hide in the suffocating shadows where she belonged. Yet the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of her constant fear suddenly felt too heavy to carry. She looked at his open posture, the complete absence of aggression in his stance, and found herself nodding slowly. Her voice was incredibly fragile, barely rising above a whisper when she finally managed to force the words past her dry lips. "The well is around the back of the cabin. You may take whatever you and your horse need. Elias offered a slow, deeply appreciative nod, his gaze lingering on her face for just a fraction of a second longer than was necessary, not with the leering judgment of the townsfolk, but with a quiet, intense curiosity. He gently led his horse toward the side of the house, leaving Clara standing on the porch. Wrapped in the sudden, startling warmth of a polite interaction, she moved slowly toward the side window. Unable to stop herself from peering through the dusty glass to watch him, he moved with a quiet, undeniable strength, the muscles in his back shifting powerfully beneath his shirt as he grasped the heavy iron handle of the water pump. He was focused, competent, and completely grounded in the present moment, a stark and overwhelming contrast to the volatile, unpredictable anger that had once haunted every square inch of his homestead. As Elias filled the wooden bucket, the tranquil silence of the evening was suddenly shattered. A fierce, sudden gust of prairie wind whipped fiercely across the open yard, catching the heavy, rotted gate of the old corral. The latch, weakened by years of severe neglect, finally gave way. With a violent, echoing crack, the heavy wooden beam splintered, causing an entire section of the fence to collapse inward with a heavy, dusty thud. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as a fresh wave of panic washed over her. In her mind, the sound of breaking was intimately tied to the terrifying consequences of failure. A broken fence meant a furious tirade, a thrown bottle, a night spent cowering in the cold corner of the kitchen. She stepped out onto the back porch, her eyes wide with terror, instinctively bracing herself for a storm of anger that she felt certain was about to come. But Elias did not curse. He did not shout, nor did he look around for someone to blame. Without a single moment of hesitation, he dropped the handle of the water pump and strode across the yard in long, ground-eating steps. He reached the collapsed section of the heavy corral just as Clara hurried forward, her hands trembling helplessly at her sides. She stopped a few feet away, expecting him to demand payment for the inconvenience or to mock her inability to maintain her own land. Instead, Elias simply crouched down, his massive shoulders bunching powerfully as he gripped a thick, splintered beam. With a low grunt of effort, he hoisted the massive timber back into place with display of raw, effortless strength that left Clara completely breathless. He held the heavy beam steady with one arm, his muscles coiled and strained, and slowly turned his head to look at her over his shoulder. He saw the genuine terror swimming in her beautiful, bruised eyes. He saw the way she was shrinking into herself, and his expression softened into something incredibly tender. "It is just rotted wood, ma'am," he said softly, his deep voice carrying a soothing, grounding cadence designed entirely to calm her racing heart. "Nothing that cannot be set right. Do you happen to have a hammer and some nails in the barn?" Clara nodded frantically, desperate to be useful, desperate to appease him before his calm demeanor vanished. She ran to the weathered tool shed, returning moments later with a rusted hammer and a handful of heavy iron nails. As she handed them to him, her trembling, delicate fingers accidentally brushed against the hard, warm skin of his knuckles. A sudden, unexpected jolt of electricity sparked at the point of contact, shooting straight up her arm and settling deep within her chest. It was the first time she had been touched by a man without flinching, the first time in eternity that physical contact had brought warmth instead of pain. She pulled her hand back quickly, her pale cheeks flushing with sudden, overwhelming heat, but Elias merely offered her a small, reassuring smile before turning his attention back to the broken fence. The rhythmic, steady sound of the hammer striking iron echoed across the darkening prairie, a strangely comforting melody that seemed to slowly drive the lingering ghosts away from the cabin. Clara stood nearby, wrapping her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as the evening air grew bitterly cold, completely unable to tear her eyes away from the sight of this massive, capable stranger mending the broken pieces of her ruined life. For the first time in years, she did not feel entirely invisible. She felt seen, acknowledged, and fiercely protected by a man who owed her absolutely nothing. When the final nail was driven deep into the wood, The sun had fully surrendered to the night, leaving the yard bathed in the cool, silver light of a rising moon. Elias wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and turned fully toward her, his tall frame casting a long, protective shadow over her delicate figure. He looked past her, his sharp eyes taking in the sagging roof of the barn, the overgrown weeds choking the garden, and the profound, haunting emptiness of the surrounding land. Finally, his gaze returned to Clara, tracing the exhaustion etched deeply into her striking features. "The wind blows mighty hard out here on the edge of the world," Elias observed quietly, taking a slow step closer, closing the distance between them just enough for her to smell the wild sage and clean earth clinging to his clothes. "A property like this requires heavy hands to keep the storms at bay. If you don't mind my asking, ma'am, where's your husband tonight?" Clara swallowed hard, the silence stretching taut and fragile between them. She looked up into his hazel eyes, searching for the judgment she always found in others, but finding only a deep, waiting stillness. "He is dead," she whispered, the words tasting like ash and sudden, terrifying freedom on her tongue. Elias did not flinch, nor did he offer empty, hollow apologies. He simply stared down at her, the subtle tension between them thickening the cold night air, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble that vibrated right through her very soul. "Then who is protecting you from the wolves, Clara?" The word hung in the frigid night air, heavy and laden with a truth she had spent years desperately trying to ignore. Clara stared up at the towering silhouette of Elias Vance, her breath pluming in small, ragged clouds of white vapor between them. He had asked who was protecting her from the wolves, and in his deep, resonant voice, the question was not a metaphor. He saw the desolate isolation of her homestead. He saw the crumbling fences and the sagging roof. And more intimately than any of that, he saw the deep, unguarded terror swimming in her bruised twilight eyes. The town of Oakhaven had abandoned her to the wilderness, leaving her to be slowly devoured by the harsh elements and the lingering ghosts of her cruel husband. Yet this stranger, a man who had only just learned her name from the hushed and bitter whispers at the general store, was standing firmly between her and the encroaching dark. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some fragile assurance that she was fine, that she was entirely capable of managing her own ruin, but the words withered and died in her throat. Elias did not push her for an answer. He possessed a rare and grounding patience, a quiet understanding that a wounded creature required absolute stillness before it could ever learn to trust. He slowly reached up and settled his weathered Stetson back upon his dark hair, the wide brim casting a protective shadow over his striking features. He told her in a soft, steady cadence that he would make his bed in the old barn for the night, ensuring that his presence would not compromise her reputation or her peace of mind. He asked for nothing more than the water he had already drawn, turning away with a slow, deliberate grace to lead his massive roan stallion toward the sagging wooden structure at the edge of the property. Clara retreated inside the dark cabin, her hands trembling as she slid the heavy iron bolt across the door. For years, the metallic scrape of that lock had been a terrifying sound, a final seal on her nightly imprisonment with a volatile and angry man. Tonight, however, the sound echoed differently against the rough timber walls. It felt entirely like a barrier keeping the danger out, rather than holding her within. She walked slowly toward the front window, wrapping a thin, faded woolen shawl tightly around her slender shoulders, and peered through the dusty, distorted glass. Out in the vast, consuming darkness of the prairie night, a small, warm fire flickered to life near the barn doors. The soft amber glow illuminated the broad, solid frame of Elias as he quietly tended his horse, his movement smooth and incredibly gentle. She stood by that cold window for hours, captivated by the mesmerizing dance of his solitary fire, feeling a strange, unfamiliar warmth slowly blooming deep within her chest. For the first time since she had arrived in this desolate country, she closed her eyes and actually slept without dreaming of falling. Dawn broke across the frontier like a bruised peach, the sky bleeding deep shades of violet. burnt orange, and muted gold to the cracked window panes of the homestead. Clara woke to a profound and startling silence, the oppressive weight that usually rested upon her chest each morning. The suffocating dread of facing another day entirely alone and utterly despised was noticeably absent. She rose from her narrow bed, her bare feet padding softly across the cold wooden floorboards, and moved straight to the kitchen to build a fire in the iron stove. As she ground the roasted coffee beans, the rich, earthy aroma filled the small cabin, a simple and comforting rhythm of domestic life that suddenly felt less like a chore and more like a quiet celebration of survival. When the coffee was dark and boiling, she poured the steaming liquid into 2 tin mugs. Her hands shook slightly as she carried them out onto the back porch, the crisp morning air biting at her cheeks and swirling the hem of her simple gray dress around her ankles. She stopped at the edge of the porch, her breath catching softly in her throat at the sight before her. Elias was already awake, already working. He had found an old, rusted axe in the shed and was methodically splitting a massive pile of seasoned oak logs near the side of the house. The morning sun caught the raw, powerful exertion of his muscles, his dark hair damp with sweat, his jaw set in a line of quiet, focused determination. The rhythmic, echoing crack of the axe blade biting deep into the hardwood was a beautiful, entirely masculine sound, completely devoid of the reckless violence she was so tragically accustomed to. She stood there for a long moment, captivated by the sheer, undeniable capability of the man. He moved with a rhythm that belonged to the wild earth, striking with precision and pulling back with grace. When he finally paused to wipe his brow, he turned and caught sight of her standing on the porch. A slow, breathtaking warmth spread across his rugged face, softening the harsh lines carved by the prairie wind. He drove the axe head firmly into a heavy stump and walked toward her, his long strides effortlessly devouring the distance between them. Clara held out one of the tin mugs as he approached, her eyes shyly darting away from his intense hazel gaze. She murmured a quiet morning greeting, entirely unsure how to navigate the overwhelming presence of a man who looked at her as if she were something precious rather than something broken. Elias took the mug from her delicate hands, his large, callous fingers briefly grazing her cold skin. The contact was fleeting, barely a whisper of pressure, yet it sent a sudden, startling jolt of electricity racing up her arm and settling deep in the pit of her stomach. She drew a sudden, sharp breath, stepping back half a pace, her heart hammering a frantic, undeniable rhythm against her ribs. He noticed a retreat, and a flicker of deep, protective sorrow crossed his eyes. He took a slow sip of the scalding coffee, giving her the space she so desperately needed, allowing the silence between them to settle into something comfortable rather than demanding. He praised the coffee with a low, rumbling hum of appreciation, his voice wrapping around her like a heavy, comforting blanket. He told her that he intended to fix the sagging hinges on the barn doors before he rode out, casually mentioning that a harsh winter wind would easily tear them entirely off their rusted tracks if left untended. He did not ask for permission, nor did he demand payment for his labor. He simply stated his intention to secure her home, speaking to her with a level of profound respect and quiet dignity that made a sudden, unexpected tear prick at the corner of her eye. Later that morning, the sun climbed higher into the pale autumn sky, bathing the dusty yard in a rich, golden light. Clara found herself drawn out of the lonely cabin, completely unable to remain within those suffocating walls while he was out there breathing life back into her ruined sanctuary. She walked slowly toward the barn, carrying a small leather pouch of heavy iron nails he had requested. The massive wooden doors were propped open, and Elias was working the rusted hinges with a heavy iron file, the muscles in his broad back shifting powerfully beneath his sweat-dampened shirt. The air inside the barn was thick with the scent of old hay, sweet feed, and the rich, masculine musk of leather and honest sweat. She stepped into the dim, dusty light of the barn, her soft footsteps muffled by the scattered straw. She handed him the heavy iron nails, purposefully keeping her gaze fixed on the rough timber of the doorframe. As Elias reached out to take the pouch, a sudden, Fierce gust of wind slammed against the heavy wooden door, tearing it from its temporary wooden prop. The massive timber swung inward with terrifying speed, completely threatening to crush Clara against the heavy iron beams of the horse stall. Before she could even register the danger, before a scream could even form in her throat, Elias moved. He dropped his tools entirely, his massive arms sweeping out to catch the swinging door with a sickening, heavy thud. The raw force of the impact drove him backward, but he did not yield, his boots digging deeply into the dirt floor as he took the entire, crushing weight of the wood upon his own shoulders. With his other arm, he reached out and grabbed Clara by the waist, pulling her swiftly and securely against his solid, unyielding chest, sheltering her fragile frame from the violent impact. The world completely stopped spinning. Clara was pressed tightly against him, her face buried in the warm, rough fabric of his shirt, her trembling hands instinctively gripping his broad shoulders. She could hear the rapid, heavy pounding of his heart beneath her ear, a steady, powerful drumbeat of pure life and absolute protection. The scent of him enveloped her entirely, a heady, intoxicating mix of wild sage, wood smoke, and raw, undeniable strength. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. The heavy wooden door rested against his back. But the true weight of the moment rested entirely in the sudden, shocking intimacy of their embrace. Elias slowly released his grip on her waist, his large hands moving gently to cup her slender shoulders, carefully pushing her back just enough to look down into her wide, terrified eyes. His chest heaved with exertion, his face inches from hers, the quiet, unspoken tension between them suddenly flaring into something fierce and completely overwhelming. He did not speak, he did not demand gratitude, but his thumb slowly, reverently traced the delicate line of her collarbone through the thin fabric of her dress. It was a touch of pure, unadulterated reverence, a silent vow that as long as he was standing on her land, nothing would ever be allowed to break her again. Clara stared up at him, her lips parted, her soul completely stripped bare, entirely unable to look away from the man who was slowly, deliberately tearing down the walls of her lonely world. The days that followed the quiet, shattering intimacy in the dusty barn slowly began to weave a profoundly different rhythm into the desolate fabric of Clara's life. The heavy, suffocating silence that had long haunted the isolated cabin was gradually replaced by the steady, reassuring cadence of honest labor and the subtle, healing presence of a man who demanded absolutely nothing but gave entirely of his strength. Elias Vance did not ride out the next morning, as he had originally suggested. Instead, he simply walked into the pale, creeping dawn, found the tools that had sat rusting in the darkest corners of the shed, and set about the monumental task of putting the ruined pieces of her homestead back together. He moved with a quiet, relentless determination, a towering force of nature systematically driving the lingering decay from the property. Clara watched him from the safety of the kitchen window, her heart caught in a strange, fragile suspension between the deeply ingrained terror of her past and the sudden, terrifying bloom of an unexpected hope. She watched him repair the sagging roof of the front porch, his broad shoulders bunching and straining as he hoisted heavy replacement timbers into place, the golden autumn sun highlighting the raw, undeniable power in his arms. He worked without complaint, entirely unaffected by the harsh prairie winds or the biting chill of the early morning frost. Every swing of his hammer, every methodical scrape of his saw, felt like a deliberate strike against the heavy chains that had bound her to the solitary, miserable existence. In the harsh and unforgiving world of the frontier, a woman without a protector was merely waiting for the wolves, and the townsfolk of Oakhaven had been more than willing to watch her be devoured by her own isolation. Yet here was a man, a solitary rider with no ties and no obligations, pouring his sweat and his life force into the dry earth of her ruin, silently building a fortress around her fragile, wounded soul. As the week progressed, the sharp, defensive edges of Clara's fear began to soften into something resembling a deeply profound reverence. The brutal, suffocating ghost of her late husband, Silas, still occupied the dark corners of the cabin, but the living, breathing warmth of Elias was slowly pushing those cold shadows back into the earth. Clara found herself moving differently through her own home. The nervous, flinching steps of a hunted creature were gradually replaced by a quiet, deliberate grace. She began to bake again, pulling heavy bags of flour from the pantry and kneading dough with a newfound, rhythmic energy. The rich, yeasty aroma of baking bread completely filled the small cabin, chasing away the stale scent of old tobacco and bitter memories. It was a simple domestic act of creation, a defiant assertion of life in a place that had only ever known slow decay. When the midday sun hung highest in the pale blue sky, Clara would carry a simple plate of warm bread, sharp cheese, and salted meat out to the yard where Elias was working. The first time she had approached him, her hands had trembled so violently that the tin plate had rattled against the wooden cutting board, her breath catching in her throat as she anticipated the harsh criticism she had always received for her meager offerings. But Elias had simply stopped his work, wiping his large, callous hands on a cloth, and looked down at her with a gaze so incredibly soft and full of genuine gratitude that it nearly broke her in half. He accepted the food with a low, rumbling murmur of profound appreciation, treating a simple, rustic meal as if it were a grand and noble feast. He never failed to praise her efforts, his deep voice wrapping around her battered self-esteem and slowly stitching it back together. The gentle, almost imperceptible tension between them grew steadily with each passing afternoon, a slow burning fire that required no sudden sparks to keep alive. It was in the way his piercing hazel eyes would track her movements as she crossed the dusty yard, filled with a quiet, burning intensity that made her skin flush with a sudden, overwhelming heat. It was in the way he naturally positioned his massive frame between her and the road whenever a solitary rider from the town happened to pass by, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line that silently promised violence to any man who dared to cast a disparaging glance her way. He was a shield of muscle and bone, entirely unmovable and deeply devoted to protecting a woman the rest of the world had completely thrown away. One evening, as the sky bruised into deep shades of violet and crushed charcoal, the biting cold of the plains forced them both inside the walls of the cabin. Clara had prepared a hot, hearty stew, setting a place for him at the heavy oak table that dominated the center of the room. It was the very table where Silas had once delivered his most venomous lectures, a piece of furniture that Clara had grown to completely despise. But as Elias sat down, his large frame dwarfing the sturdy wooden chair, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted. He did not dominate the space with loud, aggressive demands. He filled it with a steady, grounding calm, respectfully removing his worn Stetson and bowing his head in a moment of silent, private gratitude before he took his first bite. Clara sat across from him, her slender fingers wrapped tightly around her own spoon, completely unable to tear her gaze away from the striking, rugged lines of his face illuminated by the flickering amber light of the hearth. They ate in a comfortable, easy silence, a silence that felt entirely different from the terrifying, heavy quiet she was used to. It was a shared peace, a mutual understanding that words were often unnecessary when the soul was finally allowed to rest. When he reached across the table for the small dish of coarse salt, his rough, callous knuckles lightly brushed against the delicate, pale skin of her wrist. The contact was entirely accidental, a fleeting fraction of a second, yet the sheer physical impact of it was absolutely staggering. A jolt of pure, white-hot electricity surged up her arm, stealing the breath completely from her lungs and causing her heart to slam a frantic, undeniable rhythm against her ribs. Clara gasped softly, her eyes flying up to meet his. Elias froze, his hands still suspended over the table, the muscle in his strong jaw ticking as he looked deep into her bruised twilight eyes. The air between them suddenly felt incredibly thick, charged with a heavy, magnetic pull that defied all reason and logic. He slowly lowered his hand, his gaze never wavering from hers, the quiet intensity in his hazel eyes speaking volumes of a deep, entirely masculine longing that he was fiercely fighting to keep tightly leashed. He did not apologize for the touch, nor did he pull away entirely. He simply let his hand rest on the ruffle of the table, mere inches from her trembling fingers. A silent, powerful invitation for her to cross the distance if she dared. Clara stared at his large, capable hand, the very same hand that had caught a falling roof, the very same hand that had mended her broken gates, realizing with a sudden, overwhelming clarity that she trusted this man with the very fragile remnants of her life. She slowly uncurled her fingers, her hand inching forward across the cool wood, driven by a deep, entirely unfamiliar ache to be close to him, to feel the undeniable warmth of his skin against hers once more. Before she could bridge the final gap, a harsh, sudden gust of wind violently rattled the heavy window panes, breaking the hypnotic spell that had settled over the room. Clara violently flinched, instinctively pulling her hand back and wrapping her arms tightly around her slender torso, her gaze dropping to the floor. The moment was gone, completely shattered by the harsh reality of the unforgiving world outside and the heavy, suffocating memories that still lived inside the walls. Elias let out a long, slow breath, running a hand through his dark hair as he leaned back in his chair. He looked around the dimly lit cabin, his sharp eyes taking in the heavy woolen coat still hanging by the door, the scuffed riding boots sitting perfectly aligned in the corner, the meticulously kept hunting rifles mounted high on the wall. He saw the very clear and undeniable evidence of a man who was refusing to stay buried, a ghost that was actively draining the color and the life from the beautiful woman sitting across from him. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, the raw intensity returning to his rugged features as he focused entirely on her completely bowed head. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated right through the wooden table and settled deep within her very bones. "Clara," he began softly, speaking her name with a profound, aching tenderness that made fresh tears instantly prick at the corners of her eyes. A man can spend his entire life fixing fences, mending roofs, and fighting off the wolves that come circling in the dark. He can build a fortress out of timber and stone to keep the cold wind at bay. But none of that hard labor means a single thing if the true danger is already living inside the house. Clara slowly raised her head, a single, silent tear slipping down her pale cheek, entirely unable to hide the deep, profound sorrow that was fracturing her soul. She knew exactly what he was talking about. She knew that every corner of her home was entirely saturated with the poison of her past. A constant, heavy reminder of the cruel man who had convinced her she was entirely unworthy of love, of safety, and of peace. Elias reached across the table, completely ignoring the distance, and gently caught the falling tear with a rough pat of his thumb. The touch was incredibly tender, a breathtaking contrast to his massive size and raw strength. He let his hand rest against her soft cheek, a warm, unyielding anchor in the middle of her turbulent storm. "You are carrying a burden that was never yours to bear, Clara," Elias whispered fiercely, his eyes burning with a deep, protective fire that completely illuminated the darkest corners of her heart. "You are letting a dead man dictate the worth of a living, breathing, profoundly beautiful woman. And I cannot simply stand by and watch him continue to break you from the grave. When are you going to stop hiding in his shadows and finally allow yourself to step into the light?" The heavy, resonant echo of his question hung in the dimly lit cabin, vibrating against the rough timber walls and settling deep within the marrow of Clara's bones. For a suspended, agonizing moment, the entire world narrowed down to the rough, warm pad of his thumb resting against her tear-stained cheek. She wanted nothing more than to lean into that incredible warmth, to surrender the crushing, suffocating weight she carried for so many desolate years, and to simply let this towering, steadfast man shield her from the endless dark. But the deeply ingrained terror, cultivated by years of relentless emotional bruising, rose up like a sudden impenetrable wall. She violently flinched, pulling herself away from his gentle touch as if the sheer purity of his kindness had physically burned her. She stumbled backward, her chair scraping harshly against the wooden floorboards, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could not meet his intense hazel gaze. Instead, she stared blindly at the worn toes of her boots, wrapping her arms tightly around her slender torso in a desperate, deeply tragic attempt to hold her shattered pieces together. Elias did not pursue her. He did not rise from his chair or offer any sudden movements that might startle her further. He simply watched her retreat into the cold, familiar shadows of her fear, his broad chest rising and falling with a slow, heavy sigh that spoke volumes of his profound patience and his deep, protective sorrow. He knew intimately that a creature accustomed only to the cruelty of a snare would inevitably view an open hand as just another trap. He quietly gathered his hat from the table, his movements slow and deliberately telegraphed, and offered her a soft, entirely unbothered good night before stepping out into the frigid, biting wind of the prairie evening. The night that followed was a restless, tormenting expanse of hours for Clara. She lay in her narrow, cold bed, staring up at the dark wooden ceiling, listening to the rhythmic, howling wind that violently rattled the window panes. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the ghost of his touch on her cheek, a phantom warmth that fiercely battled the freezing memories of her late husband, when the pale, bruised light of dawn finally began to creep through the dusty glass. It brought with it the heavy, suffocating promise of a violent prairie storm. The sky was a churning sea of bruised purple and deep, angry slate, pregnant with a freezing rain that threatened to completely wash away the fragile peace she had found over the past week. Clara moved through the morning in a state of numb exhaustion. She built the fire, she ground the coffee, she mixed the dough for biscuits, completely driven by the hollow, mechanical routine of survival. Outside, Elias was already battling the rising storm. Through the kitchen window, she watched him moving with an urgent, raw power, securing the heavy barn doors, tying down loose timber, and moving the remaining livestock into the dry, protective shelter of the stalls. The wind whipped his heavy canvas duster around his long legs, the first icy drops of rain beginning to completely soak his dark hair and plaster his shirt to the broad, shifting muscles of his back. He was a force of nature entirely matching the fury of the storm, a guardian fiercely preparing the walls of her sanctuary against the impending deluge. Just as the sky fully broke and the freezing rain began to fall in sheets of blinding, silver fury, the heavy metallic sound of a horse-drawn wagon clattered violently into the muddy yard. Clara froze, her hands covered in white flour, her heart instantly plummeting into her stomach. Visitors never came to the edge of Oakhaven, especially not in the teeth of a rising tempest. She slowly wiped her trembling hands on her faded apron and moved toward the front door, pulling it open just as a stout, heavily bundled figure stepped onto the covered porch, violently shaking the icy rain from his dark wool coat. It was Mr. Abernathy, the town banker and the owner of the general store, a man who possessed eyes like chips of cold flint and a heart completely hardened by years of extracting bitter profits from desperate people. Beside him stood his wife, a woman whose lips were perpetually pursed in severe, unrelenting judgment. Clara instinctively shrank back, her slender frame pressing against the door jamb, a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. Mr. Abernathy did not wait for an invitation. He pushed his way into the small cabin, his muddy boots leaving dark, violating stains across the floorboards she had so meticulously scrubbed the day before. He pulled a thick, leather-bound ledger from the inner pocket of his coat, the pages damp and curling at the edges, and dropped it onto the heavy oak table with a resounding, fatal thud. He informed her, his voice dripping with a cold, absolute disdain, that he had finally calculated the remaining debts left behind by her late husband. Silas had been a man who borrowed heavily to maintain an illusion of grandeur, securing his gambling debts and his foolish investments against the very land Clara now stood upon. Mr. Abernathy looked around the dimly lit cabin, his cold eyes taking in the repaired roof, the neatly stacked firewood, and the lingering scent of fresh coffee, before his gaze finally settled on Clara with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. His wife stepped forward, her sharp eyes darting toward the window, catching sight of the massive, broad-shouldered man working tirelessly in the pouring rain near the barn. The woman sneered, her voice cutting through the quiet cabin like a rusted, jagged blade. She spoke of the shameful rumors swirling through the respectable parlors of Oakhaven, loudly declaring that it was a profound disgrace for a widow to take a wandering drifter into her bed before the earth on her husband's grave had even settled. She called Clara entirely wicked, a cursed and broken thing that was inevitably dragging a desperate man down into her own filth, poisoning the very soil of their righteous community. Every single word was a deliberate, calculated strike against Clara's incredibly fragile self-esteem, perfectly mirroring the cruel, devastating venom that Silas used to pour into her ears every single night. They demanded immediate payment, fully knowing she possessed absolutely nothing, and threatened to auction the homestead by the end of the month, leaving her completely destitute and entirely at the mercy of the unforgiving winter. Having delivered their devastating blow, they turned and walked out into the freezing rain, leaving the cabin door wide open, allowing the bitter, howling wind to completely invade her shattered sanctuary. Clara collapsed onto the rough wooden floor, her trembling hands clutching the edge of the heavy oak table as violent, racking sobs completely tore through her slender chest. The town had finally spoken the truth she had always secretly believed. She was deeply, inherently unworthy. She was a dark, cursed burden, a ruined woman who was entirely incapable of escaping the suffocating shadows of her past. She thought of Elias, working out in the freezing mud, giving his strength and his time to a woman who had absolutely nothing to offer him but shame and inevitable ruin. The thought of bringing him down, of tainting his profound, quiet honor with her miserable existence, was a pain far sharper than any physical blow she had ever endured. She had to force him to leave. She had to send him away before the poison of her life completely destroyed him. Driven by a frantic, blinding despair, Clara scrambled to her feet and rushed into the small back room. She found his heavy canvas saddlebag resting quietly in the corner and began stuffing his few sparse belongings inside with trembling, uncoordinated fingers. She was weeping openly now, the hot, bitter tears completely blinding her as she moved, desperate to sever the only beautiful connection she had experienced in years, solely to protect him from herself. The heavy cabin door slammed shut, cutting off the howling wind with a resounding crack. Elias stood in the entryway, dripping wet, his massive chest heaving, his sharp hazel eyes immediately scanning the room until they locked onto her frantic, tear-streaked face. He saw the open saddlebag. He saw the deep, absolute devastation completely breaking her apart, and he crossed the room in 3 long, desperate strides. He did not ask what had happened. He had seen the banker's wagon leaving the property, and he knew intimately the kind of destruction that self-righteous cruelty could inflict upon a wounded soul. Clara tried to push the heavy canvas bag toward his chest, her voice completely broken, begging him to take his horse and ride as far away from her cursed land as he possibly could. She wildly repeated the venomous words of the townswoman, calling herself a burden, a shameful, worthless thing that would only ever bring him misery. She pleaded with him to save himself, violently trying to push his massive, unyielding chest toward the door, her small fists weakly striking against his wet canvas duster. Elias let the saddlebag fall to the floor with a heavy, forgotten thud. He did not step back. He did not yield a single inch to her frantic, desperate attempts to drive him away. Instead, he reached out with both of his large, calloused hands and firmly caught her flailing wrists, gently but entirely subduing her frantic struggle. He pulled her forward, ignoring her broken protests, and wrapped his massive, powerful arms completely around her trembling, slender frame, crushing her tightly against the solid, grounding heat of his chest. He held her there as she completely fell apart, soaking his wet shirt with her bitter, agonizing tears. He stood like an ancient, immovable oak tree in the center of the storm, absorbing the absolute darkest, most broken pieces of her grief without ever faltering. He buried his face in her dark, fragrant hair, his deep, rumbling voice vibrating against her ear, speaking soft, fierce truths over the devastating lies she'd been forced to believe. He told her she was profoundly beautiful, deeply worthy, and entirely precious. He completely rejected the town's cruel verdict, stripping away the power of their judgment with the sheer, undeniable weight of his quiet conviction. When her violent sobs finally began to subside into exhausted, trembling hiccups, Elias slowly pulled back just enough to frame her pale, tear-stained face in his large, warm hands. His piercing hazel eyes were dark with an overwhelming, protective fury, yet filled with a tenderness so deep it completely stole the breath from her lungs. He forced her to look at him, demanding that she see the absolute, unwavering devotion burning in his gaze. "I am not leaving this land, Clara, and I am certainly not leaving you," Elias stated, his voice a low, fierce whisper that completely commanded the very air in the room. "Those people out there, they look at you and they only see the wreckage left behind by a coward. They do not see the incredibly brave, resilient woman who survived the storm. But I see you. I see exactly who you are." He let his thumbs gently wipe the lingering moisture from her bruised cheekbones, his gaze slowly drifting away from her face to scan the dark, suffocating interior of the cabin. He looked at the heavy woolen coat, still hanging by the door, the scuffed riding boots in the corner, the meticulously kept ledgers of debt, and the hunting rifles mounted on the wall, the physical, heavy chains of a cruel man who was still actively trying to destroy her from beyond the grave. Elias looked back down into her wide, fragile eyes, the subtle, healthy, sensual tension between them thickening the cold air, completely transforming the atmosphere of the room from despair into something dangerous, necessary, and entirely beautiful. He stepped back, leaving her completely breathless, and gestured toward the suffocating shadows of the room. "You cannot start a new life while you are still making room for a ghost," Elias rumbled, the quiet intensity in his voice promising a reckoning that was long overdue. "What are you going to do with all these heavy, lingering reminders of a man who never deserved you, Clara?" The silence in the dimly lit cabin stretched into a profound, suspended eternity, heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears and the sudden, terrifying promise of absolute liberation. Clara stood frozen in the center of the room, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths as she stared at the dark, oppressive corners of her own home. Elias remained perfectly still beside her, his massive presence serving as an unyielding anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. He had asked her what she was going to do with the lingering reminders of a man who never deserved her, and in doing so, he had handed her the very key to her own prison. She looked at the heavy woolen coat, hanging rigidly on the iron peg by the door. For years, the mere sight of that dark, coarse fabric had been enough to send a cold spike of pure terror straight down her spine. A visual guarantee of a harsh word or a heavy, cruel hand. It was a monument to her subjugation, a permanent shadow deliberately left behind to ensure she never forgot her place. She slowly forced her feet to move, her boots making a soft, hesitant sound against the floorboards. With every step she took toward the door, the suffocating grip of her past desperately tried to pull her back into the dark, whispering vicious lies about her worthlessness and her inevitable ruin. But then she felt the warm, grounding weight of Elias watching her, his intense hazel eyes completely devoid of judgment and overflowing with quiet, unwavering belief in her strength. Clara reached out, her delicate fingers trembling violently as she grasped the rough, stale collar of the coat. She closed her eyes, drawing a deep, shuddering breath, and fiercely ripped the heavy garment from the iron peg. She let fall to the floor with a dull, heavy thud, a simple, deeply physical act of defiance that sent a sudden, electric shock of pure adrenaline coursing through her veins. Elias did not say a word, but the subtle, proud shift in his broad shoulders spoke volumes of his deep respect. Clara did not stop there. The dam had finally broken, releasing a flood of long-suppressed righteous anger and a desperate, burning need to reclaim the sacred space of her own life. She moved to the corner of the room, her movements growing more deliberate and fluid, and snatched the scuffed, heavy riding boots that had terrorized her dreams for years. She threw them onto the center of the floor, right on top of the dark woolen coat. She moved to the heavy oak table, her hands wrapping tightly around the thick, leather-bound ledger Mr. Abernathy had dropped so violently earlier that day. It was a book entirely filled with Silas's lies, his gambling debts, and the false narrative that she owed the world something she could never possibly repay. She hurled it onto the growing pile of memories, her pale cheeks flushing with a sudden, intoxicating heat. When she turned toward the fireplace, she hesitated. Mounted high above the stone mantel were 3 meticulously polished hunting rifles, the very weapons Silas had used to intimidate her, forcing her to clean and oil them under the constant, terrifying threat of his volatile temper. They were too heavy, placed far beyond her delicate reach. Before the familiar feeling of helpless defeat could even begin to settle over her, Elias stepped forward. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his tall, powerful frame easily reaching the high wooden mounts. With a quiet, effortless display of raw strength, he removed the heavy iron rifles one by one. He completely stripped them of their firing pins, rendering them entirely useless, before adding them to the pile of ruin in the center of the floor. They were working in a perfectly synchronized, silent rhythm. A towering protector and a fiercely awakening woman systematically dismantling the physical manifestations of a deeply abusive past. Outside the walls of the cabin, the violent fury of the prairie storm had finally begun to break. The freezing, horizontal rain slowed to a light, misting drizzle, and the howling wind died down to a gentle, sweeping breeze. The heavy, bruised clouds slowly parted, revealing a vast, endless canvas of brilliant, diamond-bright stars scattered across the deep, inky blackness of the frontier sky. Elias turned toward the door, completely gathering the heavy pile of coats, boots, and broken iron into his massive arms. He looked back at Clara over his broad shoulder, his eyes catching the soft, flickering amber light of the hearth, and gave her a single, deeply reassuring nod. He pushed the front door open with his boot and stepped out into the crisp, rain-washed night, carrying the bitter remnants of her captivity out into the open air. Clara followed him, carrying the heavy, leather-bound ledger pressed tightly against her chest. The cool night air was entirely refreshing, completely stripped of the suffocating dust and the heavy, stale scent of the cabin. She walked out into the muddy yard, her eyes wide with a mixture of residual fear and an overwhelming, breathtaking sense of anticipation. Elias had moved to the center of the open space, far away from the dry timber of the barn and the wooden porch. He was actively gathering the splintered, rotted wood he had replaced from her fences and the old, discarded debris that had cluttered the property for years. He built a massive, towering structure of broken wood, placing the heavy coat, the boots, and the useless rifles deep within the center of the pyre. He struck a single match against the rough heel of his boot, the small, bright flare instantly illuminating the rugged, striking lines of his jaw. He dropped the match into a pile of dry kindling at the base of the wood. The flames hesitated for a brief, breathless moment before catching hold, rapidly climbing up the dry, splintered timber and fiercely devouring the rotting wood. The fire grew with an astonishing, roaring intensity, pushing back the cold, damp autumn chill and casting a wide, vibrant circle of dancing, golden light across the desolate yard. Clara stood a few paces away, the brilliant orange and red light completely washing over her striking, delicate features, violently reflecting in her bruised twilight eyes. Elias stepped back from the roaring heat, his massive frame silhouetted against the blazing inferno. He looked at Clara, then pointed a large, callous finger at the heavy ledger she still clutched defensively against her heart. It was the final piece, the ultimate symbol of the false debts and the unearned shame she had been forced to carry. "Let it burn, Clara," Elias commanded softly, his deep, resonant baritone completely cutting through the loud, crackling roar of the bonfire. "Throw the past into the flames and let the ash scatter into the wind. You do not owe that man, or this cruel town, another single second of your beautiful life." Clara looked down at the heavy book in her hands. She could feel the imaginary weight of the numbers, the crushing, suffocating judgment of the banker and his wife, and the lingering, venomous voice of Silas telling her she would never be anything more than a broken, useless burden. She closed her eyes, the intense, pure heat of the fire washing over her skin, completely warming the deepest, coldest spaces within her soul. She thought of the profound, quiet strength Elias had offered her, the gentle reverence of his touch, and the fierce, protective sanctuary he had built entirely out of his own honor. She realized, in a sudden, blinding flash of pure clarity, that she was profoundly worthy of that sanctuary. She was worthy of safety. She was worthy of peace. And she was absolutely worthy of being completely, unconditionally seen. She opened her eyes, of fierce, undeniable resolve completely hardening her delicate features. With a sharp, sudden cry that tore entirely from the deepest, most wounded part of her spirit, Clara stepped forward and violently hurled the heavy leather ledger straight into the roaring heart of the bonfire. The heavy book struck the burning timber, instantly sending a brilliant, soaring shower of bright orange sparks dancing high into the crisp, starry night. The thick leather cover immediately began to curl and blacken, the heavy pages catching fire and rapidly turning into brittle, glowing ash. Clara stood transfixed, her breath completely catching in her throat as she watched the final, suffocating chains of her past being entirely consumed by the pure, cleansing fire. A physical, undeniable weight instantly lifted from her slender shoulders, a completely overwhelming sensation of lightness that made her completely dizzy with relief. The fire roared higher, a magnificent, untamed force of nature that entirely mirrored the sudden, beautiful awakening of her own dormant spirit. Elias stepped slowly behind her, closing the distance until the solid, unyielding heat of his broad chest was mere inches from her back. He did not crowd her, but his towering presence surrounded her completely, a fierce, protective barrier against the vast, empty darkness of the surrounding prairie. He slowly raised his large hands, gently resting them on her slender shoulders. The warmth of his calloused palms completely seeped through the thin fabric of her dress, sending a sudden, exquisite shiver of pure, healthy sensual tension cascading down her spine. Clara leaned back slightly, instinctively trusting the solid, immovable strength of the man behind her, completely surrendering to profound, overwhelming intimacy of the moment. They stood together in the mesmerizing, golden glow of the blazing fire, watching the dark, cruel history of her life completely turn to white ash and float away on the sweeping night wind. The silence between them was no longer heavy or terrifying. It was deeply rich, completely saturated with mutual, unspoken understanding and a sudden, undeniable connection that transcended words. Elias slowly lowered his head, his face drawing close to the delicate, fragrant curve of her neck, his warm breath lightly stirring the dark, silken strands of her hair. "It is gone, Clara," Elias murmured, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated straight through her skin and settled permanently in her heart. "The debts are paid. The ghosts are entirely burned away. The only thing left standing on this land is a woman who has finally won her freedom." Clara turned her head slightly, her bruised twilight eyes entirely locking with his piercing, intense hazel gaze. The firelight danced violently in his eyes, revealing a deep, masculine hunger completely tempered by a profound, reverent patience. The space between them was charged with a sudden, breathless anticipation, a delicate, fragile threshold between the devastating pain of yesterday and the terrifying, beautiful promise of tomorrow. She was completely free of the past. But as she looked into the fiercely devoted eyes of the man who had helped her burn it down, an entirely new, unanswerable question suddenly seized her trembling heart. What would it take to completely surrender this newly won freedom, entirely by choice, into the gentle, waiting hands of the cowboy? The dawn that broke over the frontier the following morning was completely unlike any Clara had ever witnessed. It did not bleed to the sky like a bruised and battered thing, but rather unfurled in brilliant, triumphant ribbons of spun gold and soft, sweeping lavender. She stepped out onto the heavy wooden boards of the front porch, pulling a soft woolen shawl around her slender shoulders, and drew a deep, entirely unobstructed breath. For the first time in an eternity, the air inside her lungs did not feel like a stolen privilege. The scent of stale tobacco, old leather, and suffocating fear had been entirely cleansed from property, replaced by the crisp, wild fragrance of damp prairie grass and the faint, earthy memory of wood smoke. In the center of the yard, the massive bonfire had burned down to a neat, quiet pile of fine white ash, already being carried away by the gentle morning breeze, scattering the last physical remnants of a cruel man into the vast, forgetting wilderness. Elias was already awake, standing near the repaired corral, his broad back to the rising sun as he quietly brushed the heavy winter coat of his roan stallion. The rhythmic, soothing motion of his large hand over the horse's flank was a testament to his innate, grounding gentleness. He turned his head as the cabin door clicked shut, his piercing hazel eyes immediately finding her across the distance. The profound, breathtaking intimacy they had shared in the firelight still hung heavily between them, but the frantic, terrifying edge of it had softened into a deep, undeniable certainty. He did not rush toward her, honoring the incredible transformation she was actively undergoing, simply offering a warm, devastatingly handsome smile that completely melted the remaining frost around her battered heart. Before Clara could step off the porch to join him, the heavy, rhythmic thud of approaching hooves and the grating squeak of wooden wagon wheels echoed down the muddy trail leading from Oakhaven. The sudden sound would have ordinarily sent her fleeing back into the dark shadows of the cabin, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm of sheer terror. But today, her boots remained firmly planted on the timber floorboards. She watched with calm, unwavering gaze as Mr. Abernathy pulled his heavy wagon into the yard, accompanied this time by a stout, nervous-looking man wearing a tarnished tin star pin to his canvas vest. The banker had returned with the local sheriff, fully intending to enforce his cruel, baseless eviction and cast the tragic widow out into the freezing prairie. Elias immediately dropped his grooming brush, his jaw setting into a hard, uncompromising line as his massive frame instinctively shifted to intercept the men. But as he took his first long stride toward the wagon, Clara raised a single delicate hand. She did not look back at him, but her voice carried across the crisp morning air, soft yet entirely unbending. She asked him to wait. Elias stopped completely, his broad chest heaving slightly, his sharp eyes widening with profound, bursting pride as he watched the slender, beautiful woman slowly descend the porch steps to face her tormentors entirely on her own. Mr. Abernathy sneered as she approached, his cold eyes darting nervously toward the towering cowboy standing just a few paces behind her. He puffed out his chest, waving a piece of heavily stamped paper in the air, loudly declaring that he had come to seize the property as payment for the gambling markers Silas had left behind. He spoke with the same condescending, venomous tone that the entire town had used to break her spirit for years, completely expecting her to collapse into a weeping, hysterical surrender. Clara stopped a few feet from the wagon, her posture perfectly straight, her chin held high, the vibrant morning sun illuminating the striking, undeniable strength radiating from her delicate features. She did not raise her voice, but when she spoke, every single word rang with the pure, resonant clarity of a newly forged bell. She calmly informed the banker that she had spent the entire night reading through the ledgers before she burned them to ash. She stated with absolute, unwavering authority that gambling debts were entirely unsecured, completely null and void upon the death of the debtor, and held absolutely no legal claim against a deed that was rightfully recorded in her maiden name by her late father. The banker's face flushed a deep mottled crimson, his mouth opening and closing in complete, stuttering shock. The sheriff, looking entirely embarrassed by the sudden turn of events, quietly tipped his hat to Clara and forcefully advised Mr. Abernathy to put his papers away before he made a complete fool of himself. Clara stood completely unmoving, her bruised twilight eyes fixed entirely on the men who had actively tried to destroy her, completely refusing to blink or look away until they finally turned the heavy wagon around and retreated back down the muddy trail, completely defeated by the sheer power of a woman who had finally remembered her own worth. When the sound of the wagon completely faded into the whispering wind, the profound, healing silence of the prairie returned to the homestead. Clara stood in the center of the yard, completely breathless, a sudden, bright tear of pure, victorious joy slipping down her flushed cheek. She had not needed a towering hero to fight her battle, but having him stand firmly at her back, completely ready to tear the world apart for her if she asked, had given her the courage to find her own voice. She turned around slowly, her heart catching in her throat as Elias closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped right in front of her, entirely blocking out the rest of the world, his intense hazel eyes shining with a deep, reverent awe. He slowly reached out, his large, calloused hands gently framing her face, his thumbs lightly brushing away the single tear of joy. "I believe," Elias rumbled, his deep voice completely vibrating with a raw, overwhelming emotion. "That is the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed." Clara leaned into his warm, grounding touch, completely surrendering the last lingering ghost of her fear. She looked up into his striking face, the subtle, healthy sensual tension between them finally blossoming into a profound, undeniable love. "You asked me last night what I was going to do with my freedom," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fierce, beautiful hope. "I want to share it with the man who helped me find it, if you still want to stay." Elias let out a low, shuddering breath, completely closing the final fraction of an inch between them. "Clara, there is not a force on this earth strong enough to make me ride away from you," he murmured against her lips. He kissed her then, a slow, deeply tender expression of complete devotion and absolute reverence, sealing a promise that the darkness would never be allowed to touch her again. The frontier is a harsh and unforgiving landscape, a place where the weak are easily broken and the isolated are entirely consumed. But it is also a place of profound redemption, where the fires of our deepest pain can be used to completely burn away the chains of the past. True strength is not found in never falling, but in having the courage to rise from the ashes, completely refusing to let a dark history dictate the beauty of tomorrow. Sometimes it takes the quiet, unwavering love of a good person to remind us of the light we carry inside, but the power to finally step out of the shadows and claim that light will always rest entirely in our own hands.